What happens when the very science used to send a man to his death is later proven to be just plain wrong? We're about to explore a case that forces us to stare that question right in the face. It's a story about justice, tragedy, and the ultimate penalty. This is Trial by Fire.
And really, it all boils down to this one single question that has haunted this case for years. A question that, honestly, it shakes the very foundation of the criminal justice system. Did the state of Texas execute an innocent man?
To even start to get our heads around an answer, we have to go back to the very beginning, to the event that kicked this whole thing off. Our story starts with a truly horrific fire in a small Texas town.
Okay, so the date is December 23rd, 1991, just 2 days before Christmas. A fire absolutely tears through a family home in Corsicana, Texas. The father, a man named Cameron Todd Willingham, he manages to get out. But his 3 little kids, 2-year-old Amber and the 1-year-old twins, Carmen and Cameron, they're trapped inside. All 3 of them die, and the community is just left in absolute shock.
So in the middle of all this devastation, investigators, they immediately start looking for answers. And for them, the fire scene seemed to tell a pretty clear story. They were convinced this was no accident. In their minds, they had an open and shut case of arson. So here's what they latched onto. In the rubble, they found what they called pour patterns. See these strange, irregular burn marks on the floor? Back then, that was considered a textbook sign that someone had poured a flammable liquid, like lighter fluid, all over the place to get the fire going. They also pointed to this, what they called crazed glass. You see that spiderweb pattern? The thinking at the time was that this only happens in a really fast, intensely hot fire. The kind you get when you use an accelerant. It was just another piece of the puzzle that seemed to fit perfectly. And the evidence, from their perspective, just kept piling up. All told, investigators claimed they found over 20 different indicators of arson. They said the fire didn't just start in one place, but 3 separate spots. They pointed to a refrigerator that they claimed was moved to block the back door. A lab test came back positive for mineral spirits near the front of the house. And then there was this, which was maybe the most damning part. They argued Willingham couldn't have escaped through the fire without his bare feet being horribly burned. And his feet? They were completely fine. This quote from the lead investigator, Manuel Vasquez, it just says it all. It really captures the absolute certainty they had. He believed the fire itself was the key witness, that it was telling this story of a deliberate, cold-blooded murder, and he was just there to translate its language for the jury. For him, there was absolutely no room for doubt. So, on the surface, the physical evidence looked overwhelming, right? But this is where the story starts to get, well, a lot more complicated. Because once you start looking beyond the fire scene itself, the state's supposedly airtight case, it starts to show some really serious cracks. Okay, check this out, because this is where things get pretty weird. Right after the fire, every witness described Willingham as hysterical, a devastated dad who had to be physically held back from trying to run back into that burning house. But then, a few weeks later, after he becomes the main suspect, suddenly people's memories start to change. Now they recall him being oddly calm, maybe even more worried about his car. And by the time the trial rolls around, he's being painted as this cold, unfeeling monster who was just putting on an act. You see, the prosecution, they needed a motive. So they decided to paint Willingham as a sociopath. They brought up his history of petty crime, some arguments he'd had with his wife, and then they even used his taste in music against him. No joke. They argued that his posters of bands like Iron Maiden and Led Zeppelin proved he had a satanic interest in death. It's a pretty wild example of how personal taste and cultural bias can be twisted into evidence in a courtroom. And then you have the jailhouse informant, a guy named Johnny Webb. He gets on the stand and claims Willingham confessed to the whole thing. But the thing about Webb is, he was a notoriously unreliable witness who had his own legal problems to worry about. He actually tried to take back his testimony later on. Oh, and it's a fact that his own prison sentence was reduced right after he testified against Willingham. Okay, so we've got shaky witness testimony and some really questionable character evidence. But this next part, this is where the entire case against Todd Willingham really truly begins to fall apart. We have to talk about the real science of fire and how it completely contradicts the myths that investigators believed back then.
So, the most important concept we need to understand is something called flashover. Now, this isn't just a fire getting bigger. Flashover is a very specific event. It's the point where a fire in a room gets so hot that it creates this layer of superheated gas near the ceiling. And that layer radiates heat down with such intensity that literally everything in the room, the couch, the curtains, the carpet, it all bursts into flame at the exact same time. The entire room becomes the fire. And when that happens, all the rules change.
So, keeping flashover in mind, let's look at that scientific evidence again. That crazed glass? Turns out that's not from a hot fire. It's from rapid cooling, like when a firefighter hits a super hot window with cold water. That melted aluminum doorstep? A totally normal house fire gets way hotter than the melting point of aluminum. And those deep char patterns on the floor? That's exactly what you'd expect to see after a room hits flashover. The old signs were just, well, they were myths.
And here's the real kicker. A fire that has reached flashover can naturally create those deep, irregular pore patterns that investigators were so sure were proof of arson. It can create what looks like a burn trail leading to a door as the fire desperately seeks oxygen. All of these things, which looked so sinister to investigators, can happen completely naturally, starting from just one single accidental spark.
So, what about the lighter fluid they found near the front door? Well, it turns out, photos of the house taken before the fire showed there was a charcoal grill sitting right there on the front porch, and testimony confirmed there was a can of lighter fluid with it. So when the fire flashed over and roared out the front door, it would have burned up that grill, melted the can, and the water from the fire hoses could have easily washed the fluid right to the spot where investigators took their sample.
So, with modern fire science, the state's whole case for arson just completely evaporates. But here's the problem. This discovery came years after the trial. The big question became, would this new understanding of fire science make any difference at all for a man who was already sitting on death row? Did justice have a chance to catch up with the science?
Here he is, Cameron Todd Willingham, on death row. At one point, he was offered a plea deal. Take the deal, plead guilty, and you get life in prison. Even his own lawyers begged him to take it, but he refused. He said, "I ain't going to plead to something I didn't do, especially killing my own kids." He insisted he was innocent until the very end.
Just days before his scheduled execution, a detailed report from one of the country's top fire scientists, Dr. Gerald Hurst, was delivered to the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles. This report systematically destroyed every single piece of the state's arson evidence. The board's response to this groundbreaking scientific report, a unanimous 15-0 vote to deny clemency and let the execution proceed.
On February 17, 2004, moments before the state of Texas executed him, these were his final words. He used his last breath to say, one more time, that he was innocent. Then, 5 years after Willingham was executed, the state's own science commission hired an expert to review the whole case. His report was scathing. It confirmed everything Dr. Hurst had found, that the original investigation was based on discredited folklore and had absolutely no scientific basis for concluding the fire was arson.
And that brings us right back to where we started, with this one big lingering question. This isn't just about a single case in Texas, you know? It's about how we define justice itself. When the entire scientific foundation of a conviction completely crumbles away, when what was sold to a jury as hard fact is later exposed as a total myth, can we still look at that verdict and call it just? That's the question this case forces all of us to confront.